What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another video. I heard you when you commented on my Kentucky Common video using simple equipment, and you said, we want to see more of this stuff. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be breaking out the cheap, simple electric brew in a bag system, and we're going to be using it to make a MÄRZEN style Oktoberfest beer in a simple and arguably affordable way. There are generally two types of Oktoberfest beer out there. There's the MÄRZEN style lager, which is what we'll be making today. It's toasty, it's bready, it's full of really wonderful flavor notes, and it's really the more popular style of Oktoberfest beer here in America. And then there's the Fest beer, which is the much more common version in Europe and generally in Germany. This is going to be a lighter colored lager that's going to be closer to like a Helles lager. It is what you would find not only at Oktoberfest, but other festivals throughout the year, such as Frühlingsfest or Volksfest. Just know that today we're going to be making the MÄRZEN style lager, the darker, more toasty version. I realize that every single time that I make this beer style, I do a slightly different recipe, but that's part of the fun of home brewing, so I'm curious to find out what this one is going to be like. Just like most of my other videos as of late, I'm going to be walking through the process step by step as we are brewing it, not telling you in a voiceover. So strap in for a little bit longer of a brew day, but I think you're going to enjoy the detail. Real quickly, just want to give a shout out to Northern Brewer for providing all of the ingredients for this beer. Except for the yeast, I had to get that at More Beer. One of the first things I'll be doing here in this brew day as my water is being collected is I'm going to start putting together the water salts that I'm going to be using for the water profile. It's going to be a relatively light water profile, all things considered, and a little bit of a balance towards the chlorides, which helps the beer kind of feel a little bit fuller, a little bit maltier. But by not going overboard in that ratio, it's not going to be too out of balance. The water profile is going to be 35 parts per million of calcium, 3 parts per million of magnesium, 0 parts per million of sodium, 48 parts per million of chloride, 31 parts per million of sulfate, and 0 parts per million of bicarbonate. In order to get that water profile, what I'll be doing is measuring out 3 grams of calcium chloride, 1 gram of Epsom, and 1 gram of gypsum. Now I'm gonna add my water salts into the water as it's been heated up. I just used only 7.5 gallons of reverse osmosis water here. You don't have to use RO water like this. It's basically the same thing as just going to the store and either getting some store-bought RO water or some distilled water will work just as well. In fact, my water profiles are based off of 0 parts per million source water, so that would be exactly the same thing if you want to copy the exact same water profile. Really fast too, I want to talk about what the gear I'm going to be using today is. Starting of course with this, which is the DigiBoil 35 liter. This is probably the cheapest electric kettle you can find on the market that'll work for a 5-gallon batch. It's about $200 for More Beer, which is not bad, all things considered. It's really designed as more of a boiler for distilling applications, but you can actually set the temperature on it, and you can actually, if you have a brew bag like I'm using, make it into an all-in-one electric system. There's also the beer and brewing version of this kettle, which is known as the DigiMash. These are very popular kettles, but I'm showing you can go even more affordable than that. You can still absolutely do this with a stock pot on the gas burner, or an even cheaper method of heating up some water to a particular temperature, putting the mash in a grain bag and pulling it out after you're done with it. Seriously, like, because I'm showing you a specific set of gear does not mean that you need to use that specific set of gear to make the beer I'm showing you. So the next thing we're gonna be doing here is milling out all the grain. I'm gonna talk through the malts I'm gonna be using in this recipe as we do that. You do not need a mill to do this. You can always buy your grain pre-crushed or go to your local homebrew shop and mill it there. But in my case, I have a mill because I brew so frequently, so that's what works for me. We're starting out with 6 pounds of Weyermann Floor-Malted Bohemian Pilsner malt. This is a slightly under-modified malt, which means that you do need sometimes a little bit more work to get the sugars out of the starches on this one and convert it fully, but it also tends to have a little bit nicer flavor in my opinion. Next up is this, which is 5 pounds of BestMalz Best Munich Malt. This is a standard pale Munich malt. Munich malt's gonna be responsible for getting us a lot of that toasty, rich breadiness that we expect out of a MÄRZEN beer. It's also going to help darken the color of the beer quite a bit as well. But really, this is the core of any solid MÄRZEN style beer, just a good, healthy portion of Munich malt. Next up, we've got 2 pounds of Weyermann Dark Munich Malt. Dark Munich malt is going to help give even more richness, toastiness, and breadiness to this beer. And again, darkening that color down into that copper to amber region. This stuff is really, really good, but using it in high quantities can start to make the beer feel very full-bodied. So we want to try and avoid using too much of it, but it is really going to be an important flavor characteristic. And then lastly, we're going to top it off with a 1/4 pound of Weyermann Melanoidin malt. Melanoidin malt is going to basically amplify the maltiness even more, but it's giving a unique characteristic to a German beer. There is a tradition in German brewing called decoction mashing, which would normally be used for a beer like this. We're not doing that here today because that is a very intensive process and not exactly beginner friendly. But for this one, if you add in about a 1/4 pound or so of Melanoidin malt, this is going to produce very similar flavors to using a decoction mash. It's certainly not a one-to-one substitute by any means, but it's not a bad way to get these flavors into your beer. Now this is all good to go, I'm gonna start milling the grain. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and mash in just basically the process of adding in the crushed grains that you see here into the water that's been heated up. So for the mash in this beer, I'm going to be doing a step mash. If your mash tun or kettle or whatever you're using to make this beer with has any capability to adjust the temperature, then you can do a step mash. Step mash is a pretty traditional step within any sort of European beer. What it does is it really activates different types of enzymes at different temperature steps. It's not always necessary, and if you don't have the means to do a step mash, there's nothing wrong with doing a single infusion mash for this beer, probably somewhere around like 150 Fahrenheit or about 66 Celsius. So the type of mash I'll be doing today is called a Hochkirch step mash, and I'll be doing 10 minutes at 131 Fahrenheit for a brief protein rest. And then I'll step up to 146 Fahrenheit for 30 minutes, and then finally finish it off at 158 Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. The 146 degree rest is gonna help promote fermentability and drinkability of the beer. And then the 158 degree rest at the very end of it helps capture some larger sugars and help create some unfermentable sugars, which will bolster the sweetness, the body, the mouthfeel of this beer significantly. I will also conduct a quick mash out around 170 Fahrenheit, which just helps kind of drain out some of the extra wort there and get a few extra gravity points. Last time I used this system, some people were also questioning how the grain bag was not burning on the bottom of the kettle, but I do have a small false bottom at the bottom of the kettle to prevent it from making direct contact with the heating element. Things are looking pretty good. I think we're good to go. So, all right, I'm gonna go ahead now and put the lid on, and we'll get this thing going. So now I'm gonna start raising up to the next step at 146. So we'll get that going here shortly and start stirring it up too. All right, so now it's time to raise our temperature up to the next step, which is 158 Fahrenheit. We'll let that start working now. All right, so now it is time to raise to the mash out temperature of 170. All right, so the mash is complete now, and it's time to start separating out the grain from the rest of the wort. And the way we do that is by pulling out the bag. It's gonna be heavy and it's going to be hot. So definitely kit yourself up with some brewing gloves when you're doing this. Don't be afraid to squeeze the bag, but let it drain over the course of a few minutes to get yourself down to the right level in the kettle. So for example, if I want 5 gallons at the end of the process, I'm expecting to have about 5.5 gallons of wort going into the fermenter because there will be sludge at the bottom of the fermenter. Similarly, I want about 6 gallons of wort post-boil because there's gonna be sludge at the bottom of the kettle as well. So in order to figure out how much wort to collect before you start your boil, you generally wanna look at what your boil off rate is. Here, in my case, it's gonna be about 1 gallon per hour. And so therefore I wanna get about 7, maybe a little over 7 gallons of wort in the kettle before I start the boil. It looks like, despite my best efforts, the best I was able to get was about 6.5 gallons into this thing. So we're a little short on volume here. So I just checked on my pre-boil gravity and I found it to be a whole 5 points higher than the target pre-boil gravity. So I'm actually gonna be able to add a little bit of extra water in here to make sure that we hit the right pre-boil volume without too much worry about the gravity itself. Normally I wouldn't care too much about the gravity itself, but I want to make sure I have a full 5-gallon batch of this because as an Oktoberfest beer, it's going to go away pretty quickly, especially with guests at the house. All right, so I am going to start my hop additions here with what is known as a first wort hop addition. This is 1 ounce of 4.8% alpha acid Tettnang. A first wort hop addition is used somewhat often in traditional European beers because it is said to promote a little bit of a smoother bitterness. I'm doing it because it's kind of the way I've always done these beers and it's what I'm comfortable with doing, and I like the way it works. What first wort hopping really means is just taking your hops and adding them directly into the wort before you've hit the boil. So as you've finished your mash, you've run off your wort, it's now time to add your first wort hops as you heat things up to a boil. So that is now 1 ounce of Tettnang going in directly. Because this system is not recirculating and does not have a pump, I don't need to worry about anything getting clogged, so I can add the hops directly into the kettle like I just did. We're now gonna start setting things up so it goes to a boil. Also, as we get close to the boil, I'm gonna add some of this. This is Firm Cap S, just a few drops of this stuff into your wort as it is heating up. Will help to break the surface tension of all of the foam from the proteins that forms on the surface of the wort as you're getting ready to boil. This stuff is known as hot break. It's a good thing. You want a good hot break, but it also has a tendency, if there's a lot of it, to boil over. So boil over is not a good thing in brewing. Nobody wants sticky, boiling hot sugary liquid everywhere. It's a mess to clean up and it can be dangerous. So adding in some Firm Cap S is a cheap and easy way to help combat that. As this is heating up, I'll talk real quickly about the hops. As you saw, threw in some Tettnang. Tettnang is one of my favorite German noble hops. It's like spicy, it's slightly herbal, it's a little less floral to me than Hallertau Mittelfrühe is, which is a fantastic hop as well as in its own right. I found for like my palate, my personal preferences, I love Hallertau Mittelfrühe in hoppy lagers, and I love Tettnang in malty lagers. Either way, it's 100% Tettnang today. We're throwing in 1 ounce at first wort for a calculated 18 IBUs, but I think the perceived bitterness will actually be less than that. And then we're throwing in just a 1/4 ounce at 30 minutes to get 3 IBUs and kind of keeping the hop flavor from being too prominent in this beer. I want it to be primarily malts, and I want that to still be having a balanced bitterness with it, but by adding in something at mid-boil, I kind of get a little bit of both, a little bit of hop flavor, a little bit of bitterness, and I like the way that that presents. All right, so based on the volume and the gravity of the pre-boil measurement that I got, I added a little bit more than 1/2 gallon to this to bring it up to about 7 gallons of pre-boil wort. And we are now officially starting our boil. I'm gonna do a 60-minute boil for this beer. So our next hop addition, since there's no 60-minute addition, is actually gonna be the 30-minute mark. So we'll come back in 1/2 an hour for that. All right, so now it's time to add in our 30-minute hop addition here. This is just about a 1/4 ounce of Tettnang. It's 30 minutes into the boil, and that will go for another 30 minutes. All right, so now it's time to add in something I add to pretty much every single beer now. That's this here. This is a Whirlfloc tablet and some yeast nutrient. Whirlfloc helps the beer to clarify faster. It helps to separate out a lot of the protein gunk that you can see currently in the kettle. And then the yeast nutrient, of course, is really just like cheap insurance to help ensure you have a good fermentation. It's healthy. I honestly credit using yeast nutrient for shorter fermentation durations overall. But anyway, that goes in now 10 minutes prior to the end of the boil per the manufacturer instructions. So let this go for 10 more minutes. While I wait for everything to finish up here, I want to quickly talk about the yeast selection for today's beer. This is White Lab's WLP 860 Munich Lager in the dry format. I love the fact that White Labs is releasing all of these awesome strains in dry format. This particular strain of yeast, though, is awesome. It's the Augustiner strain. I've used it many times for Munich-style lagers, maltier lagers. Last year, I used it for my Oktoberfest lager, which was a fest beer. And it was the Imperial L17 Harvest version of the same strain. It's a really nice lager strain that pushes maltiness forward more than many other strains, but it still allows it to attenuate really well and get a very high drinkability level in the beer. It's honestly one of my favorites, and the fact that it's a dry strain now, just consider me sold. All right, so now the boil is over, so it's time to transfer the wort into the fermenter. I'm actually not even gonna chill the beer down. I'm gonna transfer it directly into the fermenter because this is a stainless steel bucket fermenter. It can handle the heat. I'm going to gradually cool this thing off over the next several hours in my chest freezer, just to be sure that it is safe to pitch the yeast on top of it, and it'll take a while. Another note about the gear, again, I'm not using a chiller, I'm not using a pump in this because those are relatively expensive homebrew items, and they're not really fully necessary, especially when you're brewing malt-forward beers. But this bucket fermenter here, I have the Anvil bucket fermenter. There's many others that are very similar in price and very similar in construction. A stainless bucket fermenter of some kind is honestly one of the most versatile items you can have in the brew house. Even though I own multiple stainless steel conical fermenters, I still use this Anvil bucket fermenter every so often, and a little bit more so now that I'm focusing on the budget-friendly beers. It is one of the most future-proof purchases you can make in your home brewing journey. That being said, you can absolutely get away with a plastic bucket, but just make sure you're not transferring the boiling wort directly into the plastic. Some plastics can handle that, but not all of them can, so just be sure of the makeup of your bucket. Either way, this is going to function pretty much identically to a plastic bucket, except it's a little easier to clean and it's obviously a lot more heat tolerant. All right, so the brew day went really well. Got my hydrometer sample cooled off here. It's still not totally down to 60 degrees where the hydrometer is calibrated, but still it's about 1050, a little over that. With temperature correction comes in about 1056, which is actually right on target, which is awesome. Another fantastic brew day, 2 for 2 on the Digiboil plus brew in a bag setup, so I'm really happy with this. Wort color is a little lighter than expected. It's coming in like a dark gold color, but I'm wondering if after fermentation and when we put this in like a thicker glass, if it's gonna come in more of a copper color at the end of it. I had a little bit of a problem keeping consistent temperatures in the Digiboil this time. It was swinging a lot during the mash. Regardless, the temperatures that we were in were generally in the right place for the step mash for generally the right amount of time. So I do feel like it's still gonna be fine. But just something to note, either way, I'm gonna let this thing get down to about 65 degrees. It'll take maybe 6-8 hours, maybe overnight, depending on how this goes. All in all, really fantastic brew day. I'm excited to see what this one turns out like. It is the next morning. Took that long to chill everything down to about 65 degrees, but here we are. So, got my 1 packet of White Labs WLP860, and I'm also going to be adding in a few enzymes to help make the process a bit easier. First of all, ClearZyme. It's an enzyme that eliminates chill haze or helps prevent it from happening in the first place, which will ultimately help the beer to clarify a lot faster. And secondly, ALDC, which is going to help prevent the yeast from creating diacetyl, which is pretty awesome as well. Just 1 dropper full of each of these go in before pitching our yeast on top of it. All right, so let's really quickly talk about the fermentation plans for this beer that I have. So I'm gonna be using WLP860 for this beer, which is the Augustina strain, and of course the dry version of that, making life just a little bit easier. Traditionally, for a lager fermentation like this one, people will say, well, you probably shouldn't ferment that above like 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Realistically though, this particular strain of lager yeast is capable of going a lot warmer than people give it credit for. Just like the Weihenstephan 3470 strain, the Augustiner strain is very capable of higher temperature fermentations, almost into the ale realm of fermentation temperatures. I would not personally recommend taking the strain above about 68 degrees Fahrenheit or about 20 Celsius, but experiences may vary, and I've had great success taking the W3470 strain all the way up to that range. I've used Imperial L17 Harvest, and I've taken that all the way up to about 65 degrees with 0 issues whatsoever. That being said, I am still going to be using a temperature-controlled setup, so a fermentation fridge that's controlled by an Inkbird temperature controller, putting my Anvil bucket fermenter in that, and making sure that the temperature is relatively consistent around about 65 to 68 degrees. A higher temperature fermentation is going to take a much shorter period of time, not only to start but also to finish, relative to a colder temperature lager fermentation. For this particular beer, I do expect it to be finished within about maybe 7 to 10 days. At that point, it will probably not be clear, but it will be complete with its fermentation. As soon as the fermentation is complete, instead of cold crashing this beer and drawing oxygen into the anvil bucket fermenter, I'm going to transfer into a keg and then cold crash in the keg. This is going to help clarify the beer. It's going to help make things a lot simpler and prevent oxygen from being drawn into the beer as it's cold crashing. And once again, in another very anti-Reinheitsgebot move here, I'm going to be throwing some gelatin findings into the beer to really just accelerate that clarification process. Couple tips for success on this beer. Number one, the high temperature fermentation really is your friend here. And when I say high temperature, I mean high for a lager yeast, right? 65 to 68 degrees is a normal ale fermentation temperature range. But for a lager yeast, traditionally you would look at that and be like, that's way too high. You're gonna get a bomb of fusel alcohols and you're gonna get so many esters, the beer's gonna be undrinkable. A lot of people are working on this stuff. A lot of people are showing that that is not the case at all. And I have done this a lot myself, and my anecdotal experience aligns with theirs. Hence, I'm doing it. Seriously, feel free to test this out on your own. If you wanna challenge that methodology, I'd recommend you do it yourself. Regardless, high temperature fermentation, number one, requires less yeast to get started. One of the reasons why lager pitch rates are traditionally higher is because of the colder temperature fermentation. This increases the stress on the yeast and typically requires you to pitch twice the pitch rates that you would normally otherwise be using. Also, lower temperature fermentations tend to encourage sulfur production. This is, in some quantities, not a bad thing for a lager. It's part of their quintessential character, but it does take a long time for that sulfur character to leave the beer or get processed by the yeast during the lagering phase. If you ferment at a higher temperature, that sulfur will actually off-gas during the process of fermentation. And also, a higher temperature fermentation is typically going to prevent diacetyl from forming in the beer. At the end of a traditional lager fermentation, you would do a higher temperature diacetyl rest to help the yeast metabolize all of that diacetyl and get rid of it as you are getting ready to keg the beer later. This is not necessary with a high temperature fermentation, as it will metabolize it during the entire process. The second tip for success here is still, even though I'm taking a lot of shortcuts in this beer, still let your beer lager if you can. All lagering means is cold storage. And all that cold storage is doing is it's refining the beer, it's allowing particulate to drop out of the beer, it's allowing flavors to kind of mellow out and meld together, and that is a very important part of a lager's character. I've said this in pretty much every single lager video I've done so far, and I stand by this. If you're putting your beer into a keg and you're throwing it into a kegerator at serving temperatures, or you're putting your beer into bottles and you're putting those bottles into the fridge, you are lagering your beer. It doesn't need to be in the fermenter to do this. It doesn't need to be in a lagering tank or a bright tank to do this because you're not a professional brewer. Just put it in the keg, put it in the bottles, leave it in the fridge for a long period of time, and you're good to go. This is why oftentimes if you let a beer sit in the kegerator and you don't touch it for a long time and you pour another pint a couple weeks later, all of a sudden this beer's character has changed and it might be more refined. That's because it's been lagering. So even though I'm using gelatin findings to accelerate the process and Whirlfloc and all of these other anti-Reinheitsgebot processes, it doesn't mean that the beer is 100% what it could be. That lagering phase, I do still believe, has some sort of magic to it that does actually refine the flavor of the beer over time. It's just a matter of being patient with it. As far as alternative use for this beer go, besides WLP 860, which I'll be using here, the Augustiner strain is also available as Imperial L17 Harvest, Omega OYL 114 Bayern Lager, and Yeast 2308 Munich Lager. You can also probably get away with 2206 as well from Yeast, and it'd be a very similar character overall. And a couple other alternate options for dry yeast out there. I've made excellent Munich style lagers using Diamond Lager from Weyermann. Also, Saf Lager S23 makes some pretty good ones as well. But the reason why I say I don't recommend going for a super full-bodied, super malty lager profile on this one is because these beers are really designed to be consumed in large quantities very easily. And so that's where I really feel like the Augustiner strain absolutely shines. It's that middle ground between really promoting a nice punchy maltiness, but then getting out of the way, and also still attenuating the beer to a really nice level where you're still getting a lot of high drinkability out of it. 3470 would do a similar job, and honestly, that's gonna be probably the easiest yeast to find for this type of beer, and it makes a decent Oktoberfest, don't get me wrong, but it really is one of those strains that tends to attenuate a lot more. It'll make an excellent, very drinkable beer, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but it can take away from some of the maltier flavors. For the reasons I mentioned though, keeping that balance between drinkability and flavor, I'm gonna be sticking with the Augustiner strain in this one, and I'm very excited to see what it does in a few weeks when it's all ready. So I will catch you then.
Fermentation for the beer was unsurprisingly quite quick and very, very healthy. We ended up with a final gravity of 1011, as seen here in this hydrometer sample, after only 6 days of fermentation. As soon as I confirmed that final gravity, I simply transferred into a CO2 purged and sanitized keg, and then began the process of both carbonation and lagering. I did actually add in some gelatin findings into the keg that helped accelerate the process, but the beer was fully carbonated and tasting absolutely phenomenal about 2 weeks later, when I finally tasted the beer here. This beer is called Dr. Strangebrew, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Warm-Fermented Lager, and it comes in at 6.0% ABV and 21 IBUs. For the appearance of the beer, it's definitely on the lighter end of a MÄRZEN beer style, but when it goes into a 1 liter mass krug like this, it does still have enough depth to pick up a lot of color. So in this case, it is really showing as a nice copper color, just a hair darker than orange, and has perfect clarity. It's also pouring with a phenomenal cream colored head. This head not only builds up to a great level and leaves great lacing, but also remains for a very long time. Even though this beer has been sitting on my desk for about an hour while I edit this video, it still has 2 or 3 millimeters of head that just remain on the surface. It's a really, really awesome thing to see.
All right, so let's go in for aroma. Ooh, yeah. The aroma on this beer, it's richly malty. It's got that wonderful, characteristic MÄRZEN Munich malt character. Just a really beautiful toastiness, a really nice hint of bread crust, and then just dark, rich maltiness, but no caramel. It smells rich, it smells really like a treat. I don't think I'm getting any hop spiciness off of this. Yeah, no hops character, no yeast character. Let's go in now for mouthfeel. Mouthfeel in this one's a little bit difficult to describe. It is a nice medium-bodied lager, but it's a very smooth presentation. It's not creamy or fluffy or anything like that. It's just more of a smoother kind of presentation, but not quite to the level of like a Czech lager. Somewhere in between. It's got a little bit of a hint of crispiness to it. Yeah, I think it's well attenuated, which helps a ton with the crispiness. Man, this thing is easy to drink. I also feel like I could really get away with carbonating this a lot more. When you are drinking it though from a 1 liter mass krug like this one, it could stand to have a bit more foam, it could stand to have a bit more life in it, because it's not gonna foam out of the glass as easily as a smaller glass. I really feel like the step mash there is the reason why the mouthfeel is the way that it is. It still is an extremely drinkable beer with a great level of attenuation, but a good solid mouthfeel to it that's substantial. So you have this nice paradox of being able to easily drink the beer, easily consume the beer, but it still has a lot of nice, refreshing and satisfying qualities to the texture. All right, so now let's move on for flavor. I'm gonna put this up front, I think. This is definitely easily like one of the top 2 MÄRZEN style beers that I've made. It's got a wonderful bready, crackery base. That crackery base is also supplemented with some slight honey notes that I really like. There's a beautiful, deeply rich maltiness to it that's not sweet. It's just bready and rich. It does have a pretty significant melanoidin character. I can recognize that now. I feel like this really is the truest to style MÄRZEN beer that I've brewed. The reason for that being that there's no caramel malts in it. The color, the flavor, everything was entirely Munich malts, Pilsner malts, and that little tiny bit of melanoidin malt. Normally I would throw like a little bit of Carafa 2 in there to adjust the color, or a little tiny bit of Cara Munich malt in there to get some sweetness, but this does not need that. It's much toastier than a Vienna lager, and it's got more depth and richness to it. than a Vienna lager, but not quite as much as something like a Bock beer. There's a slight hint, like a whisper, of almost a chocolatey character, but not quite something sweet. There's also just a hint of like a noble hop expression in there, a tiny bit of herbal kind of spiciness. There's also a prominent cereal-y note in this, like almost like a honey cereal, like Cheerios or something like that. It's really nice because it just really anchors down the beer. I'm 99.9% sure that that is the Weyermann Floor-Malted Bohemian Pilsner malt. And then yeah, the whole thing is just brought together by the WLP 860. That particular strain is just so good at blending drinkability and attenuation with still pushing that malt to the front and giving you such a quintessentially German character. I'm also especially proud of the fact that I can get a good color like this without any caramel or color malts. And again, it's the second time in a row that I've used this really affordable, relatively cheap system to build a fantastic beer. This is just as good of a beer, if not better, than the beer that would have been made by my Clawhammer supply system or any other higher-end electric system. You don't need the expensive gear to make great beer. And even though the system didn't really maintain great temperature consistency, the beer that came out of it was exactly on target and actually way exceeded my expectations. The last piece of it here too that I want to talk about is that there's zero evidence that I used a high temperature fermentation. There is no fusel alcohols, there's no excessive esters. This is absolutely clean as a whistle, and it still has that quintessential Southern German lager character. There is absolutely nothing about the fermentation profile in this beer that indicates that it was fermented outside of the typical manufacturer recommended range. So there you have it. Another entry into the very long growing list of high temperature lager success stories. I can't think too much about potential improvements on it, but if there's anything I was going to change about it, I think it would probably be just getting some more color in here. This is actually technically still within the style guidelines as far as color goes for MÄRZEN beer, but I could stand to see it be a bit darker. They could maybe replace 1 pound of the Pilsner malt with 1 pound of dark Munich malt to get a little bit more in there. You could also sprinkle a tiny amount of Carafa too at the very end of the mash, get that recirculated in. I do really hope you have a wonderful Oktoberfest season, and if you want to make this particular beer, the exact recipe is going to be in the description box down below, as well as a link to Brewfather where you can find the Brewfather recipe page that I made for this particular recipe as well. So feel free to copy that over and adjust it to your own systems and brew away. You can get this thing grained to glass in 2 weeks or less, so there's plenty of time left to brew it in the year. If you enjoyed the video, if you found it useful, you learned something, you got inspired, whatever, please go ahead and hit that like button. It is the #1 thing that helps this channel out because it makes things more visible. And I know it's annoying to hear, but it's something that we have to say because that's really how this business works. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and comment down below with your thoughts, your opinions on everything. What's your Oktoberfest plans? What are you brewing? I love talking with you guys about this stuff. It's just fun. If you want to support the channel, consider picking up a t-shirt like this one. You can find this design and plenty of others in my merchandise store, which is also linked in the description box. I get a small kickback from that store and those sales, and you get a t-shirt or something else out of it, which is pretty fun. I also have a Patreon, and my patrons are the reason why this channel is still moving along. To be fair, you guys are actually the #1 financial supporter of the channel by a long shot. Thank you so much for what you're doing to keep this channel moving. It really does mean more to me than I think you know. If Patreon is not your thing, I also have channel memberships, and there's the super thanks option as well, which are both down below the video, and both of those go right back into the channel just like Patreon support. And lastly, there's also an Amazon store in the description box where you can find all my production equipment. You can find my recommended brewing equipment that's available on Amazon on that store as well. All of that stuff, it is no additional cost to you if you purchase something through the store, but I do get a small kickback, which again helps to support the channel. I'm also available on Instagram and Facebook as The Apartment Brewer if you're curious about additional content beyond YouTube. You get to see what's coming to the channel, you get to have a good time, and of course I'm also accessible in the direct messages on those platforms as well. And last but certainly not least, if you are still watching at this point, thanks for continuing to watch the whole video. I know this one's going to be longer just because of the whole talking through the brew day segment, but either way, it means that you enjoyed the video, it means you got something out of it, and that's all I want. So this one goes out to you guys, and I'll catch you all in the next one. So until then, Prost.